I want you to think about the first time you turned on a Nintendo Switch. The first time you slid the Joy-Cons onto the sides, heard that click, and watched the screen light up. Before you even started playing anything, there was already something weird about it. Because for years, consoles were objects that lived in one specific spot. Your home console was under the TV, and your handheld was in a case. And I think we take for granted now just how revolutionary the Switch was at the time, and how special that feeling was of just first getting the system. A lot of you are probably even playing a Switch right now as you're watching this video. So the Switch launched 9 years ago. Yeah, 9 years. And I had to sit with that for a second because it generally doesn't feel real. To put that in perspective, 9-year-olds whose first console was a Switch in 2017 can legally drive a car now. The system doesn't feel 9 years old because it never disappeared. It is still getting games in 2026, but this was the last console of my childhood, and its run began when I was in middle school and ended when I was already done with college and had a full-time job. If you're anywhere around my age, there's a good chance you'll have a similar experience to the one I'll talk about in this video. And if you're younger or older, maybe I could give some perspective as to what it was like to have the Switch as my last childhood console. So I was just 14 when it came out, and it was the first console I ever pre-ordered. I made sure to lock in a system from GameStop as soon as it became available. Even before the console had a name, lead-up was enormous. Remember all the NX rumors, remember seeing the first trailer during school in October 2016 and talking about it with friends. Remember the hype around the showcase in January with the system being shown off in all its glory, as well as a new 3D Mario and also this. I don't think I've ever seen this much hype for a console. I don't think I've ever seen anything else like that, and if it has, it didn't get nearly as much attention. You also gotta remember that the Switch wasn't coming off a victory lap, it was coming off the Wii U. If you were paying attention to Nintendo in 2016, there was this uncertainty that hadn't been there before. The Wii had been everywhere, your parents had one, your grandparents had one, then the Wii U happened and that energy just evaporated. PlayStation and Xbox were running the next gen conversations, and Nintendo was doing its own thing off to the side. It wasn't irrelevant. Okay, maybe kind of irrelevant. I talked about this in my previous video, about how kids and teens just didn't really care about Nintendo anymore during the Wii U era. Everyone had a Wii, everyone had a DS, but only the biggest Nintendo fans had a Wii U. Things changed though when the Switch came out, and it did that faster than anyone expected. Not in some dramatic industry-shifting moment all at once, but it was just in the way you would notice things. Suddenly people around you had Switches. Kids who had always had a PlayStation or an Xbox wanted a Switch, just because for $300 you got a hybrid console that could play home console games on the go. Before I continue, I just want to say, if you're enjoying this so far, be sure to subscribe, and consider checking out these two videos when you're done. I walked into GameStop on launch day knowing exactly why I was there, and so did everyone else in the store. No one was browsing, everyone was there for one thing, and that was the Switch. When they handed me the box, it was a lot smaller than I expected. Previous home console boxes felt like they contained machines, but this one felt like it could fit in a bag. I got home, opened it, and slid the Joy-Cons in for the first time, and I heard that click and then booted up Breath of the Wild. If you were 14 years old playing that game for the first time, it was overwhelming. All the Zelda games I'd grown up with were big but structured. Most were fairly linear and had a set order. You also were limited to where you could go. And then Breath of the Wild changed that. You could go anywhere, you could do anything with the physics. And while I personally like Tears of the Kingdom a little better, one thing Breath of the Wild will always have over it is just the experience of seeing that version of Hyrule for the first time. This game was hyped for years. It was supposed to come out in 2015 on the Wii U, and obviously didn't come out until 2017 where it came out on the Wii U and the Switch. And the conversation surrounding this game went on for a very long time, but what made it even better was that you weren't alone in it. This was one of those rare moments where a huge number of people were all inside the same single player game at the same time and talking about it constantly. You'd show up at school and the first 5 minutes of any conversation were about Breath of the Wild. Someone had a story about getting struck by lightning because they didn't realize metal weapons attract electricity during storms. Two people could put 10 hours in and come back with extremely different experiences depending on which direction they wandered. It turned a single player game into something that felt social without anyone actually playing together, which almost never happens nowadays. Also worth noting, another launch game alongside Breath of the Wild was 1-2-Switch, a $50 game built around milking imaginary cows and staring into another person's eyes pretending to draw guns at each other. One of the greatest open world games ever made, and a tech demo about feeling balls through HD Rumble, available simultaneously on the same new console. I know a lot of people hate on 1-2-Switch, but I always found it to be a fun game, even if it should have been a pack-in title. I went to a friend's house the day the Switch came out, and we all just played it for hours. I was also in middle school at this time, and before school started, we would just hang out in the hallway playing random 1-2-Switch games, which probably looked extremely goofy to anyone watching, but it was still a blast. The first year just kept going after that. Usually there's a long quiet stretch after the launch while the library catches up. Instead, Nintendo did ARMS, which was a strange and divisive game, but was actually pretty good. Then Splatoon 2, then Xenoblade 2, then Mario Odyssey at the end of the year, which felt absurd. 2 generational games in the first calendar year of a system. This truly made Nintendo seem like they were back. Something I keep thinking about is how quickly the social atmosphere around Nintendo shifted after the Switch launched. Not just that it sold well, but the actual feeling of being a Nintendo fan changed almost overnight. During the Wii U years, there was this subtle defensiveness to it, like you'd mention the Wii U in a conversation about games, and someone would get a look on their face like you told a Pokemon card scalper he had to shower. Most of the gaming conversations at school were about PlayStation and Xbox. Those were next gen. If you brought up the Wii U, there was a decent chance you would get laughed at, which honestly was partly Nintendo's fault for a lot of reasons. They just made all the ads look like this console was for kids, which is not how middle schoolers wanted to seem. They wanted to seem cool with the Xbox and PlayStation. But then the Switch erased that pretty fast. Suddenly Nintendo wasn't the thing you had to justify having anymore. Someone would ask if you had Mario Kart the same way they'd ask if you had Netflix. They'd just assume you probably did. You'd see someone take out a Switch at launch and it seemed normal. Joy-Cons getting passed around, or I'm sorry, sharing the joy as Nintendo liked to say. It just felt like the norm to have a Nintendo console again for the first time in years. Smash Ultimate made this even more pronounced when it arrived. Now for those of you who have watched my previous video about the Wii U and 3DS era, you'll know I used to play a lot of Smash 4 and it's how I made a lot of friends, but Smash Ultimate was just so much better. I was in high school by the time it came out and I still did some tournaments, I still played with friends before school, and it was one of the games I played when I went to a friend's house, just like Wii U and Brawl were in past generations. But besides all the memories from multiplayer, which obviously was a huge aspect, there were a lot of great single player games. Breath of the Wild and Odyssey both took up weeks of my life. Breath of the Wild itself was my game for like a month, and I was just addicted to it. I'd play it on car rides, I'd play it in bed, I'd play it on the TV. There was just always something to do in it. And since this was the only big Switch game at the time, it needed to really carry the system, and it did that perfectly, which is something I feel like Mario Kart World lacked on the Switch 2 launch. It just didn't keep me interested that long. And then Odyssey, which came out months later, was different but had the same effect. I played through the main game pretty quickly, but that was only a drop in the bucket of my experience. I used to watch YouTubers like DGR and Fearsome Fire do these crazy challenges trying to make seemingly impossible jumps or go through an obstacle course without jumping, and I would spend hours trying to recreate those myself. What made both those games stick is that they were happening at the same time as everything else. You could think about a specific part of Breath of the Wild and immediately know what you were doing in your life. I can think about the kingdoms in Odyssey and remember exactly where I was sitting. These games got attached to that period in a way that most games don't, and I don't really know how to explain it. I feel like the portability just changed the relationship too. Older consoles meant the game lived in the living room and you went to them, where the Switch game was just wherever you were. Of course there were handhelds, but those were much different experiences than true home console games. Over the next couple years, the Switch kept getting new games, new third-party support, which was a big thing for Nintendo at the time, as almost no third-party company supported the Wii U, and Nintendo was thriving during this time. But a few years into the Switch's life cycle, something happened that nobody had in their predictions. A global pandemic, and suddenly everyone was home. The Smash sessions that happened naturally because everyone was already in the same place stopped, but of course with online, that was still a big part of it. That's a way I stayed connected with a lot of friends, just playing Smash and other games online. But there was one game that came out in 2020 that kind of changed everything. Animal Crossing is a game about slow routines. You check in every day, talk to your villagers, plant some flowers, build something gradually over weeks and maybe even months. It's a very low stakes game, it's very stress free, and New Leaf was one of my favorite games of all time. And while I like it better than New Horizons, the time that New Horizons came out in was maybe the most perfect launch timing for any game ever made. Kids weren't in school, most people didn't actually have to go out for work, and Animal Crossing just felt like you had your own escape, your own town that you could do whatever in, and even connect with friends in. People who had never touched Animal Crossing were logging in every morning like it was a job they actually wanted. People were posting island screenshots everywhere, and I knew people who put more hours into New Horizons in the first 3 months of 2020 than they'd put into pretty much any game in years. There was just something about the combination of the game's pacing and that specific moment that was just perfect for the time. And even besides Animal Crossing New Horizons, the Switch was just a way to keep busy during that time. Since pretty much everyone had a Switch, you could still stay connected. Imagine if the Wii U was the console at this time. A few years into the Switch's life, my life was changing. The system launched when I was in middle school, and I was now off to college. The people who I would see every day and play Smash or Mario Kart with were no longer people I saw often. The Switch followed people into the next phase anyway. The same console that had been in cafeteria tables ended up on tables in college apartments. The Smash Smashes that used to happen at lunch started happening late on a Wednesday night when nobody had anywhere to be the next morning, which was kind of its own freedom. It was the same games but completely different versions of life around them. When you're in middle school or high school, you don't typically hang out with friends late in the middle of the week, but in college that's different. Can't tell you how many times I played Smash Ultimate or Super Mario Party or Mario Kart 8 Deluxe with friends in college, and it seemed like everyone just had a Switch. It was the norm at the time. If I had been in college 5 years earlier, I can only imagine how few Wii U's there were on campus. Now, we still played on the Wii a lot, but I don't think I went a single day without seeing someone with a Switch in some way. Whether it was just seeing someone sitting down in a building playing on the Switch, whether it was visiting someone's dorm, there was almost always a Switch. For people my age and around my age, this console went through a lot. Started when we were in middle school, lasted throughout high school, and even went into college. So the Switch doesn't feel like it was just in one point in time, kind of like how the Wii U for me was my late elementary school and middle school years. The Switch just encompassed so much more of that. When I think about Switch games, I don't think about them as a library, but I kind of think about a lot of them as timestamps. I think about Breath of the Wild and Mario Odyssey as 2017. I see Luigi's Mansion 3 as 2019. This was the first console I was really old enough to remember every single thing from. While I remember a lot of the Wii and DS era and 3DS and Wii U era, I was still very young at the time. I remember everything from the Switch era. I think part of that is that these games followed you anywhere. I may play 3DS games in short bursts, or I might sit down at home and play a Wii U game, but for the Switch, if I was playing a game at the time, I was playing it anywhere. Whether I was at school, at home, at a friend's house, that game followed me around and just stuck in my mind. I mentioned third-party support in this video a little earlier, but I think we kind of underestimate how important it actually was. Like, playing Skyrim on the go was insane. It feels like it added some legitimacy to the Switch, and that kind of led to the entire industry changing. Now we have so many competitors like Xbox ROG Ally, the Steam Deck, and a bunch more that are meant to be like AAA games on the go, but there was no real competition for the Switch at the time, and that was just something really special. Now let's go back to 2025. The Switch was approaching 8 years old, and rumors of a successor were swirling for a long time. And then we got the Switch 2, which was the first time Nintendo labeled a console with 2 in the name besides the 2DS, showing that the Switch was so successful that they didn't really want to change much. They wanted to just make a more powerful Switch. And it was a bittersweet moment. It was time to move on from the Switch as the technology had been aging, and new AAA third-party games couldn't really run on it anymore. But for those 8 years, it was with me for some of the biggest shifts in my life. And it probably was for you too. Even now, it doesn't seem like the Switch is dead. There's still brand new Switch games coming out. There's still probably tens of millions of people who use a Switch almost every day. While the Switch era is technically over, as it isn't Nintendo's most current console anymore, it completely changed Nintendo and gaming forever. I have so many memories associated with this system that I don't think I'm ever going to have on another console. The Switch 2 is great, but it came out in my 20s. It didn't come out when I was 14 and last until I was 22. The Switch 2 and on will all be consoles that come out as I'm an adult, and I'm sure I'll be nostalgic for the Switch 2 in 20 years, but it's never gonna feel the same as a Switch, as the Wii U, as the Wii. That's something that makes the Switch a very special console for me. It was with me for a lot of those formative years of my life, and was the last console I got to enjoy as a kid, before having all these responsibilities, and I'll never forget that. If you were tracking the Switch from the outside, whether it was sales numbers, industry coverage, how Nintendo was being written about, what you saw was a comeback story. 150 million plus units sold now, some of the best-selling games of all time, some of the best games of all time. But if you're anything like me, it meant so much more than that. You remember first playing Breath of the Wild, you remember the first time you played Smash Ultimate, you remember the first time you actually saw a Switch in person. The Switch was Nintendo's comeback, yeah, but I also think it was the last console generation where gaming felt genuinely woven into everyday life for a lot of people, specifically in the way it does when you're young enough that it happens automatically, without effort, just because you're surrounded by the same group of people all the time. When you're in school, a big game coming out means everyone around you is playing it simultaneously because you're all in the same building for 7 hours a day. It's just something that happens, and it's only going to be true for a small part of your life. If you were around like 10 to 16 or so when the Switch came out, you went into this generation just being a kid, and are now either done with school and college, or even have a full-time job. I look back on all my Nintendo consoles fondly. I look back at the DS and the Wii for getting me into gaming. I look back at the Wii U and 3DS for being my systems for a few years and having so many quirky ideas. And I look at the Switch for changing gaming and bringing Nintendo back. And that's what it was like to grow up with the Switch as my last childhood console, and I'm sure a lot of you can relate to this. If you haven't, be sure to check out my video on the DS and Wii era and the 3DS and Wii U era, as you may find those relatable too. People like to talk about how big of a success the Switch is and all the games, but I also like to look at the nostalgic side of it. Like, what about the experiences made it special? If you did enjoy this video and want to see more, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, and also consider joining my Discord. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.